Good day. Today, Monday, 16th October, we are roughly 10 days from the start of that terrible attack by Hamas against southern Israel, the one that led to the storming through of the Israeli fences and fortified positions, the capture of Israeli army bases, the capture and killing of Israeli soldiers, destruction of Israeli military equipment, and the storming of various kibbutz located in this area of southern Israel, and the attack on a music festival and the killing of civilians in all of these places, and the capture of civilians and the taking of those civilians to Gaza, where they're being held by Hamas as hostages. And of course, since that time, we have seen the emergence in Israel of a national government, a government that brings together the various parties. Prime Minister Netanyahu remains Prime Minister of Israel. There has been a massive Israeli bombing offensive against Gaza, which still continues. There have been demands from Israel for over 1 million people to leave northern Gaza and to travel to southern Gaza. There's been suggestions from various Israeli officials that the entire population of Gaza leave Gaza City in its entirety and relocate in Sinai. There's been apparently, this is said by news agency reports which I have seen, there's apparently been contacts by the Israeli government with the Egyptian government and apparently with the government of Qatar. The idea being that the Egyptian government should open the crossing points into Gaza and from Gaza into Sinai, into Egypt, to allow the population to move from Gaza into Egypt, into Sinai. And the government of Qatar, which has been for some time now Hamas's major financial backer, they should provide the funding to provide relief for the civilian population, the people from Gaza, relocating to Sinai. And in the meantime, supposedly, and I take this now from an article written by Seymour Hersh, the Israeli plan is that with the entire population of Gaza having left Gaza, the Israeli army will then roll in. There will be massive bombing attacks with huge bunker-busting bombs supplied to Israel by the United States. This, it is assumed, will destroy the tunnels and bunkers in which Hamas is assumed to be hiding, and the Israeli forces will move in and will mop up what's left. That is the scenario that Seymour Hersh outlines, and it does seem consistent with a lot of the other reports we are seeing. Meanwhile, alongside all of these demands from Israel, all this massive violence and destruction, there are now calls from the United Nations, from the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Guterres. He's calling for a ceasefire. He's calling for relief supplies to be allowed into Gaza through the crossing point into Egypt. And he also is calling, very properly, for the unconditional release by Hamas of all of its hostages. Now, I've just summed all of these points up, all of these events up, all of these facts. This has been a factual description, as far as I can make it, of what has taken place over the last 9 days. As I said, massive violence, massive indiscriminate violence, deliberate targeting and killing of civilians, seizure of hostages, a land, sea and air blockade, preventing the export of food, fuel and water into Gaza. All of this has been going on. There's been widespread admissions, commentaries in much of the Western media about war crimes having been committed, war crimes by both parties, by Hamas and by Israel. I mean, that's been commentaries to that effect. There's been all these statements by the United Nations. And I noticed that one particular agency has remained entirely silent. And I just wanted to mention this briefly. I'm not going to return to this point again, but the agency in question is, of course, the International Criminal Court. Now, of course, neither Hamas nor Israel are parties to the Rome Statute, but then neither is Russia. The UN Security Council has not referred either Hamas or Israel to the International to the Criminal Court, but the UN Security Council didn't do the same either over Russia. The International Criminal Court has nonetheless authorized a prosecution against President Putin of Russia and one other senior Russian official over the alleged abduction of children from the Donbass area. I've made clear my own views about that prosecution makes absolutely no legal sense whatsoever, and I cannot see that there has any factual or legal foundation at all. But in the face of these, I think most people would agree, far more extraordinary, far more terrible, far more appalling events that we have seen, apparently it has absolutely nothing to say. Well, as I said, I don't intend to return to this topic. It's just a point that I did want to make. So far as I can see, there hasn't even yet been a warning from the International Criminal Court that there might be war crimes and that they might be minded to make an investigation. And I'm not even sure, by the way, whether there's been any statements by other agencies that might be interested in looking into these kind of questions, the International Committee for the Red Cross or any of those. It seems to me that if one is looking for different standards to be applied, well, here you have a spectacular example. And again, I notice with interest that no one in the Western media seems to be at all concerned by this fact. Anyway, now let us come to rather more serious questions. What exactly is happening, where we are moving at this moment? Now, over the last few hours, the Israeli bombing offensive of Gaza has continued, and I've had a number of extremely helpful commentaries from various people, including one particular source who has been consistently reliable on many matters, but whom, of course, I can't identify. Anyway, the first thing to say is that it seems that Israel has a stockpile, or rather the United States in Israel has a stockpile of around 25,000 bombs. I understand that these are both guided and unguided, and that these will be made available to Israel. And Israel, of course, has its own stockpile. Having said that, if we start with that figure of 25,000 bombs, and if it is indeed actually the case that Israel is dropping 1,000 bombs on Gaza a day, then, or so it seems to me, that is only enough for around 3 weeks, 3.5 weeks of bombing. And if this the level of bombing does indeed continue at the current rate, then I do wonder, frankly, how sustainable this ultimately is. There's also been a flurry of reports, including by Seymour Hersh, that the Israeli military is fully aware of the enormous challenge that a ground operation in Gaza would cause, would lead to, that there are concerns that Israeli infantry, mainly reservists, mostly made up of reservists, lack the training and the organization for this kind of fighting. It's also been suggested that the Israeli army, has mostly been operating in kind of policing type of activities for some years now in the West Bank, and that much of the army, therefore, is unprepared for this kind of ground war. And that this may explain some of these extraordinary proposals for displacement of entire populations, for unrestrained bombing campaigns. Prime Minister Netanyahu has apparently reiterated that the objective of this campaign, this Israeli campaign, is the total destruction of Hamas. One understands the immense political imperative to do this within Israel itself and on the part of Prime Minister Netanyahu's coalition partners, but with concerns about the nature of a ground operation coming to the fore. One can see why, as I said, governments in Israel, the government of Israel, the Israeli military, may be looking at solutions, if they are solutions, which in my opinion will only lead to far greater problems in the future for Israel and for the entire region, and which in fact, in my opinion, probably aren't solutions at all. Unrestrained bombing campaigns, expulsions of entire populations, populations where I notice even President Biden himself is now admitting that Hamas does not speak for every Palestinian, or even indeed most of them, that these type of responses have the capacity to actually make the situation worse rather than better. And I said that it's not just myself who's saying it. There's been some powerful articles now appearing in, for example, there is an article in Foreign Affairs, the magazine, one of these three big heavyweight magazines that appear in the United States, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, and the National Interest, which between them set out the views of America's foreign policy establishment. Anyway, there's been a long article by a person, Mr. Mark Lynch, and it says that an invasion of Gaza would be a disaster for Israel. That's the title. America must prevail on its ally to step back from the brink. And when you read through the article, it makes many of the same points that I've been making, that fighting in an urban context, the kind of urban warfare that Gaza would represent, incredibly difficult battle. It's been pointed out that heavy bombing of a city, far from actually simplifying, making advance of troops easier into that city, it actually creates even more opportunities for the defenders, more ruins and rubble that the defenders can use to defend themselves. Anyway, there's comments like that, including, by the way, in that same article by Seymour Hersh that I spoke about. Anyway, there's been, the article makes that point that a ground invasion might not turn out well, and bombing by itself isn't going to solve the problem. Trying to starve the Gaza out, if that's the plan with this blockade, that's not going to solve the problem either. On the contrary, it is going to involve Israel in what would be widely seen, and which UN agencies are already starting to speak about as a potential war crime. And it wouldn't, as I said, most likely succeed and would cause more political problems. And, of course, the displacement of an entire population could easily, well, it would be a catastrophe for the Middle East, for Egypt, for relations between the Muslim world and the West, and most probably, in fact, almost certainly, it would not resolve Israel's security problems. It would worsen them. And this article, as I said, appears in Foreign Affairs. And the article expresses dismay that the administration, the Biden administration, doesn't seem to be doing anything to try to dissuade Israel from taking steps like this. I'm not sure that is entirely true, by the way, but anyway, that is what this article says, that the administration needs to be much clearer and stronger with the Israelis, and needs to explain to the Israelis that in their own interests, they should hold back from doing these things. Now, I'm just going to quote one paragraph from this article. It says, this is precisely the time that Washington must be the cooler head and save Israel from itself. The impending invasion of Gaza will be a humanitarian, moral, and strategic catastrophe. It will not only badly harm Israel's long-term security and inflict unfathomable human costs on Palestinians, but also threaten core US interests in the Middle East, in Ukraine, and in Washington's competition with China over the Indo-Pacific order. It's amazing how these articles always talk in these extraordinary geostrategic terms, that it's all now framed as part of this global competition with China. And then the article goes on to say, only the Biden administration, channeling the United States' unique leverage and the White House's demonstrated close support for Israeli security, can now stop Israel from making a disastrous mistake. Now that it has shown its sympathy with Israel, Washington must pivot toward demanding that its ally fully comply with the laws of war. It must insist that Israel find ways to take the fight to Hamas that do not entail the displacement and mass killing of innocent Palestinian civilians. And as I said, there's an awful lot more in this article. There's been similar shorter articles in Responsible Statecraft, the internet publication of the Quincy Institute, and there's been similar articles appearing in many other places in the media in the West as well, including in places like The Guardian, The Daily Telegraph in Britain, and other places like that. So we can see that doubts about this ground offensive are there. Perhaps they're even increasing. I've also, by the way, read somewhere that the structure of the Israeli military is not conducive to this type of operation. This, I think, as I recall, comes from a Russian source. They've pointed out that whereas in the Russian military, and by the way also the Ukrainian military, there is brigades bring together both infantry and tanks. In Israel, by contrast, brigades tend to be pure. They are either exclusively infantry or exclusively tanks. The rationale being that Israel, being a relatively small country, you don't need to create these kind of composite brigades, because brigades can work closely with each other so that infantry brigades can be deployed to complement the tank brigades when they're needed. Now, I should stress, I don't know whether that is true, but the Russians say that I presume it was the Russian, I think it was the Russians say that this idea is flawed, and I'm inclined to agree. It says that the effect of this is to complicate the command chain, make it more difficult to achieve coordination, and reduces the quality of training. And of course, in an urban warfare setting, having the various component parts, the tanks and the infantry, coordinate closely with each other is even more important than it is in any other field of war. Anyway, that's what I've been reading. There are, as I said, all of these commentaries. Now, for the moment, the Egyptian government seems to be standing firm that they are not prepared to allow millions of people from Gaza to pour into Egypt. They are prepared to open the crossing points into Gaza, to allow humanitarian supplies into Gaza, and they are also prepared to let foreign citizens who are located in Gaza, and there are known to be many from many countries, many from Europe, European countries, various European countries, from other countries as well, including Russians, by the way, and that they're prepared to open the crossing points to allow these people to leave, but not to allow the vast exodus of the population. And through much of the day, up to the point where I'm making this program, there are lots of reports and arguments and discussions and debates about whether or not these crossing points are going to be opened. The Egyptian authorities are complaining apparently that it is the Israelis who are not opening the crossing points to enable all of this to happen. And there's been a lot of acrimony and bitterness about all of this. Again, I'm not close enough to the scene of events to be able to say definitely what exactly is the case. And it could be that simply there's been a lot of confusion. It may be that the relevant people are busy, preoccupied with other matters, and that the relevant decisions, which would have to, I suspect, be authorised at the top political level, have simply not been made yet. And I would quickly also say that there were rumours, lots of rumours, earlier in the day that the Israelis had supposedly agreed to some sort of ceasefire over southern Gaza. They've been insisting that the entire population of northern Gaza leave and move to southern Gaza. It's been suggested that up to 600,000 people have done so, but I've also heard that this is exaggerated. I have no idea who is keeping track of numbers. I'm going to, as I said, give a pass on that one. No doubt many people have left, but what the actual numbers are, I don't know. But anyway, it's been suggested that the Israelis, whilst making clear that northern Gaza is absolutely a scene of fighting, that they would agree to a ceasefire over southern Gaza. The Israeli authorities have now categorically denied that that is the case. And I have to say, I wonder whether this was perhaps something that was being urged on the Israelis, either by Western governments or by the UN agencies, because I've never seen any hint of this from the Israelis themselves. But if, of course, there is no ceasefire over southern Gaza, then it must, to a certain extent at least, call into question the entire logic of demanding people leave northern Gaza and go to southern Gaza. If southern Gaza is not protected by a ceasefire, what is the safety? Where is the safety of going there? Or at least many people will be asking that question. Now, there's also been increasing exchanges of fire. I'm using my words very carefully. In northern Israel, southern Lebanon, exchanges of fire between the Israelis and the Hezbollah militia. The intensity of this, again, I'm not really able to discuss, but it does appear that gradually, steadily, the situation is getting worse. And there's been an ominous development in that it seems that the Israeli authorities are now calling on people in northern Israel to leave the area. I mean, this is a report I have seen. In fact, there's several reports to this effect that I have seen. And that might suggest that the Israelis worry that there might be intensified fighting along the border between Israel and Lebanon. And there have been all sorts of warnings, some would call them threats, from Israel about massive retaliation against Lebanon and Hezbollah as well if the fighting there escalates. So the situation has or retains the capacity very much to spiral out of control. Now, there have been other signals which may point in another direction. I said in my program yesterday that there was a report from Axios that the Iranian government had apparently or supposedly warned Israel that in the event that there was a ground operation by the Israeli forces into Gaza, Iran would feel obliged to respond. I said that I wasn't absolutely sure that this was the case, but it did seem very likely. And in most places, this report from Axios was accepted as true. I recall that I believe it was the Daily Telegraph republished that story as if it were true. And then over the course of the rest of the day, there were fresh reports which seemed to say something completely contradictory, that the Iranian authorities had supposedly actually told the Israelis that in fact, so long as the fighting is confined to fighting between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, then the Iranian military will not become involved. They will only become involved if there is an Israeli attack on Iran itself. Now, I wonder whether the second isn't perhaps the correct statement of what the Iranians actually said. Shortly after this conflict began, I said that there were lots of reports circulating there were lots of articles and reports circulating in various parts of the media, including a particularly strident one in the Wall Street Journal, which appeared to be calling for a joint US-Israeli military attack on Iran, some kind of settling with Iran, which is being held accountable for the whole affair, the whole crisis that we're in at the moment. And I wonder whether someone somewhere who still wants that to happen took this reassurance that the Iranians may have given to the Israelis, that they don't want to become involved in the war, that they're offering moral and perhaps even some material support to Hamas, but they're not directly involved in the fighting with Hamas, and that they don't intend to take any actual military action, provided they're not attacked. And of course, if they are attacked, then they will defend themselves. Whether somebody didn't seize on that and turn it round to make what was, I think, intended to be a de-escalatory statement, and they didn't represent it or misrepresent it in order to make it into some kind of a threat or warning against Israel, which might have implied that Iran was more deeply involved in this crisis than it actually is. Now, I say all of that, there's been multiple reports over the last couple of days, which have appeared in the US media, places like Politico and others, which basically seem to accept that Iran had not been consulted in advance by Hamas of its military operation. And I strongly suspect that this is indeed the case. I don't think it is in Iran's interests to have a crisis in the Middle East of the type that we're seeing happen at this particular time. They've just successfully forged a new relationship with Saudi Arabia. They're in the process of negotiating a big arms deal with the Russians. They're still waiting to get their Sukhoi 35 fighter jets, which they would take a long time to integrate in their armed forces and to train on even after they arrived. And they're also looking for economic relief, having just joined the BRICS, through new economic and trading relationships with countries like China and Russia. So I cannot see why the Iranian government would want a crisis on its hands at this particular time. And I think that the reports that the Iranians were caught by surprise by this event are probably true. That's not to say that someone in the very complex Iranian system might not have been tipped off by Hamas that this was coming. It's conceivable that some ultra-hardline force within Iran might even have encouraged it to happen. I mean, I don't know much about the way in which the political system in Iran works, but I would be prepared to believe that. But I think the leadership of Iran, the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, the president, Ebrahim Raisi, their officials, I'm confident that they were not involved. American intelligence and Israeli intelligence appear to think so, and all the indications, to my mind, somewhat confirm that. Now, yesterday in my program, I said that recent protestations from Hamas, that their fighters got out of control, that there was no actual plan or intention on the part of Hamas to launch indiscriminate attacks against civilians in the kibbutzim or in respect of this music festival, I said that I didn't believe these claims. And overall, I have to say I still don't. I still believe that the murder of civilians, the taking of hostages certainly, were always a part of the plan. But this source that I spoke about, one that, as I said, I can't identify. Anyway, he has suggested, and this does appear to be based on some actual information, that though the attacks on the civilians were almost certainly intentional, certain leaders within Hamas, members of its civilian leadership, were not informed in advance and were shocked by what happened, and that there's been some degree of recrimination within Hamas over this. It's been suggested that over the last few years, as a result of the fighting that's been taking place in the Middle East, the various Middle East wars, in Iraq, in Syria especially, that sections of Hamas have become even more radicalized than they already were. Hamas fighters, some Hamas fighters and some Hamas leaders might have become close to or even involved with ISIS and some of the insurgent groups in Syria. I think it is extremely likely that they were in fact involved with many of the insurgent groups in Syria that were fighting the Assad government. After all, the Muslim Brotherhood was at the core of the original uprising against Bashar al-Assad in 2011. And as I've discussed previously, the Hamas has links, ideological and organizational, with the Muslim Brotherhood. And I think it is perfectly plausible that some Hamas fighters went to Syria to fight alongside their Muslim brethren, if I can call them that, against the Assad government, and came into contact with people with even more militant ideologies and methods, and brought them back with them to Gaza when they eventually returned there. I'm perfectly willing to believe that. Anyway, the groups of fighters and leaders of that nature gradually gained control of Hamas's armed wing, its military wing, and that the political wing, which looks back to an earlier Hamas and which has a more political perspective, was not informed or consulted in advance about what was going to happen, and that they too were taken by surprise and have been shocked and understand or believe that the fighters and the soldiers went too far. Now, I've heard this. This is a reliable and well-informed source. It could be true. Hamas does not take me into their confidence. I don't know anything at all about its internal workings. So I just report this. It's been said to me. I can't say whether or not it is true. But this source did make a further point, which undoubtedly is true. And it's not so much about Hamas, but it is about Russian policy. And it no doubt goes far to explain some of the very careful steps taken by the Russians, the various comments that President Putin of Russia has been making over the last couple of days about this crisis, the apparent distancing itself from Israel that the Russians have been undertaking. And this source has pointed out that 10% of Russia's population is Muslim, that Muslims in Russia are also heavily concentrated in specific regions, in Tatarstan, but also most specifically in the Caucasus, where, of course, the Russians had to fight a long and bitter war against jihadi fighters. And they simply cannot simply disregard the feelings of these Muslim people within Russia, in the northern Caucasus and in Tatarstan, who are, of course, very, very strongly pro-Palestinian, and who are also feel extremely strongly, as all Muslims do, about any challenge, any conceivable risk to the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock and the various other Islamic religious buildings that are to be found in Jerusalem, in the Haram al-Sharif, the Temple Mount, which has recently been threatened. And apparently, the most important and powerful Muslim of all in Russia, Ramzan Kadyrov, president of Chechnya, is has particularly strong feelings about this issue. He has been making some very, very strong comments about it. And of course, from a Russian point of view, from the perspective of the Russian government, Ramzan Kadyrov, who has helped the Russians achieve peace in the Northern Caucasus, and who has also raised 3 regiments of Chechen fighters and further battalions of Chechen fighters, all of whom are playing a critical role in the special military operation in Ukraine. That Kadyrov is simply not someone that the Russians can ignore and whose feelings they can simply disregard in this matter if he feels particularly strongly about what is going on in the Middle East, then the Russians have to take his concerns extremely seriously. Now, there are reports today that President Putin is intending to speak over the course of today to 3 of the most important persons involved in this conflict. One is Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and it has been pointed out by many people that Putin has not, up to this point, actually telephoned and spoken to Netanyahu, as perhaps he might have been expected to do right after the original Hamas attack took place, to express his sympathy and condolences for the dead and his support for Israel. Putin has held back from doing that. I suspect that there's been a complex and difficult discussion between Russian and Israeli officials in the lead up to this call, but this call is now taking place. And Putin also is going to be calling President Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority. It is important to say that whilst Russia maintains contacts with Hamas, diplomatic contacts with Hamas, and has even received Hamas delegations, the Russians still continue to recognize President Abbas and the Palestinian Authority as the major representative, the key representative of the Palestinian people. And I suspect that in any negotiation that the Russians try to broker, any mediation process that they try to set up, they will treat the Palestinian Authority, not Hamas, as the major interlocutor, the major representative of the Palestinians. Hamas, the Russians, in their usual realistic way, the Russians recognize that Hamas cannot be simply ignored or disregarded, but as I said, it will be the Palestinian Authority, the PLO, Fatah, in other words, who the institutions, the organizations that lie behind the Palestinian Authority, that will be the organizations that the Russians will principally want to work with in any negotiation. And the third person that President Putin apparently also intends to speak to today is President al-Sisi, the president of Egypt, obviously a key player in this conflict. Egypt remains the biggest Arab country. It is where the Arab League is located. That's where its headquarters are located. And of course, Egypt, along with Saudi Arabia, will shortly become also a member of the BRICS. So we see that having laid the groundwork, so to speak, with various statements, President Putin is now starting to engage in some degree of active diplomacy. There are also reports that President Putin intends, over the course of today, to speak to a fourth Middle East leader, President Bashar al-Assad of Syria. We will see whether that discussion does indeed take place, and obviously I will be covering all of these conversations in my video tomorrow, when the Kremlin provides us with detailed readouts of all that has been said. Since I'm talking about Middle East diplomacy, it's worth adding that Secretary of State Blinken has also been on his travels in the Middle East. Apparently, he had a cool reception in Egypt. His reception in Saudi Arabia was apparently even cooler. Perhaps icy would be the appropriate word. It seems that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, Saudi Arabia's Prime Minister, kept him waiting all night long before he finally agreed to meet Blinken, and it seems that nothing very much of a productive nature, at least, has come out of the meeting. The West has been talking up the discussions that the Biden administration has been actively pursuing for Saudi Arabia and Israel to establish diplomatic relations as part of an overall agreement between the Saudis and the Americans to move forward in their relationship, with the Saudis agreeing to reduce the price of oil, act to increase oil production so as to reduce the price of oil, and the United States in return looking the other way, even as Saudi Arabia supposedly presses forward with a nuclear weapons program. The last is my interpretation of what the American offer to the Saudis has been. But anyway, I have always thought, that those talks were perhaps rather less real than many in the West imagined. And putting that aside for the moment at least, with this conflict underway in Gaza, in Israel, Palestine, those negotiations are now to all intents and purposes dead. So that's the state of play in the Middle East. I should say that President Putin, coming back to him, is most probably planning to go to China over the next day or so. His foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, has already arrived in China, and Putin himself has given a long and very interesting interview to the Chinese media, which is usually a sign of an impending visit. I get the impression that he has delayed his visit by a day, whilst he talks to the various Middle East leaders, Netanyahu, President Abbas of Palestine, I could call it that, President al-Sisi of Egypt, possibly also President al-Assad of Syria, conceivably even MbS, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who's to say. But anyway, I suspect that President Putin is now going to be engaging in a heavy round of telephone diplomacy, as is his way, and I guess that he'll delay his trip to China perhaps by a day until that is done. And I think the Chinese, for their part, will be completely understanding of the importance of doing that. And it could be that when President Putin does arrive in Beijing, and by the way, the date of his arrival in Beijing has never been formally confirmed. When he does arrive in Beijing, I would not be surprised if the trip is extended by a further day to make up for the time that has been lost. Anyway, that's where we are in terms of the overall state of things in the Middle East. I may as well add, on top of all the other things that I've been saying, that I think at the moment we are still in an exploratory period in this crisis. Hamas made their dramatic move on the 7th of October. I think the Israelis are still trying to decide exactly how to respond. Do they limit themselves to a blockade of Gaza? Do they conduct an aerial bombing campaign against Gaza? Do they try to get the Egyptians and the Qataris and the other Arab states, and by the way, the Americans and the Europeans, to agree to a displacement of the population of Gaza into Sinai? Do they start a ground invasion? I think the Israelis have still not fully made up their minds exactly what they should do. I think they are alive to some of the problems that they could be faced with if they did advance into Gaza in the way that's been suggested. And I think that this, more than any other factor, explains the pause. Now, President Putin, the Middle East isn't the only crisis that he has to attend to. And there are also reports coming out of Moscow that in a couple of hours, or perhaps even by the time this program has been made and published, he's going to get a briefing on the state of the fighting in Ukraine, where, of course, fighting continues at a very intense level. Now, I think it is generally acknowledged by most people, except, of course, in Ukraine and by a few Western officials and by a few Western journalists, that we are now essentially at the end of Ukraine's offensive. The Ukrainian offensive has, to all intents and purposes, come to an end. And as Putin said yesterday in that television program that I talked about in my previous video, the offensive has resulted in Ukraine capturing a small number of villages and some open fields and wooded plantations, but with Ukraine failing to make a breakthrough in any location and failing to achieve any of the strategic objectives it had set itself when this offensive began. Now, over the course of his very long and very interesting interview with the Chinese media, President Putin added a few further points. He said that the Ukrainians had suffered enormous casualties over the course of this offensive, and he said that the ratio of casualties as between the Ukrainians and the Russians is 8-1, that the Ukrainians lose 8 soldiers for every 1 that the Russians lose. Now, that has given us some insight into total Russian losses over the last couple of months since the start of the Ukrainian offensive on the 4th of June. If the Ukrainians have lost, as Putin claims, around 90,000 men, then the Russians logically must have lost around 10,000 men. Now that is killed and injured. And the Russians claim, General Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, has claimed that in the great majority of cases, Russian troops who get injured in the war not only survive their injuries, but achieve a full recovery, and in most cases are able to rejoin the fighting. Now, there's been a series of reports now in the Western media, including places like The Economist, talking about the fact that it is the Russians at the moment who are engaging in offensive operations in various parts of the battle line. And today, I've seen a number of reports in the Western media, the British media, based on Ukrainian briefings about the fighting in Avdeyevka. And I have to say that this is another one of those instances when Russian reports, which continue to speak of steady, incremental advances by the Russians around Avdeyevka, are at diametric opposite points to the briefings that the Ukrainians are giving. Now, I am going to now read from a report by The Guardian, the British newspaper The Guardian, about the nature of the fighting in Avdeyevka. And it's clear that this is based exclusively on Ukrainian briefings. And in fact, we're even given the identity of the Ukrainian officer who has conducted the briefing. It is Colonel Dmytro Lysyuk, who is the commander of Ukraine's 128th Separate Mountain Assault Brigade. Anyway, this is what The Guardian says. And I'm going to actually pass this report a little because I find it very interesting, and I'm going to make a number of suggestions about what it actually means. It says, the report reads as follows: at least 3 Russian battalions, each supported by an estimated 2,000 to 3,000 troops, began a dawn attack on Tuesday. That is to say, an attack on Avdeyevka. Now, already there are problems because it says at least 3 Russian battalions, each supported by an estimated 2,000 to 3,000 troops, began a dawn attack on Tuesday. Now, by my understanding, a Russian battalion numbers around 500 men. Perhaps if you want to stretch it, it could be as high sometimes as 800 men. It's a reinforced battalion, but that would suggest a total force of 2,500 men at most. Well, here we see The Guardian says that each battalion is supported by an estimated 2,000 to 3,000 troops, which would suggest a combined force of 6,000 to 9,000 men. Well, it may be that the latter figure is correct, but in that case, we're talking about a force of more than 3 battalions. So already we can see that there appear to be some problems with this report. And then the article goes on to read, drone footage showed a line of military vehicles trundling forward. There has been intense fighting ever since. Russia has bombarded the city with relentless artillery fire and airstrikes. Ukrainian military officials say Moscow's goal is to encircle Avdeyevka, but so far the attackers have made modest gains. So that tells us that the Russians have made some gains. And then he goes on to say this: Russia's 25th Combined Arms Army pushed forward from the south and north. Now, that may be correct, and it's certainly true that the Russians have been pushing both from the south and from the north. As I said, there's a pincer movement that is closing around Avdeyevka. Avdeyevka is surrounded by the Russians on three sides. But anyway, this reference to the 25th Combined Arms Army is somewhat confusing to me, because by my understanding, the 25th Combined Arms Army, which is a new formation that the Russians have put together over the last couple of months, that it has been committed in the Oskol River area just south of Kupiansk, that it is not participating, in other words, in the fight for Avdeyevka. Now, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm confused about the exact whereabouts of the 25th Combined Arms Army, but anyway, I have to say that this doesn't make a huge amount of sense to me, and I wonder whether, in fact, the information that's being provided is fully correct. But then the article goes on to read, that is to say, presumably the 25th Combined Arms Army, seized the nearby village of Berdichi and closed in on a 150-metre high slag heap next to the town's coke and chemical factory. Now, that doesn't seem to say clearly whether the slag heap has actually been captured by the Russians. Of course, the Russians say that it has been. There have been other reports that the Russians pulled back and that it's in the grey zone, but this is a little ambiguous. But the report says, and this does seem to be based on, as I said, a Ukrainian briefing, that the Russians have seized the village of Berdichi. Now, this is interesting because though there were some claims about a couple of days ago that the Russians had indeed captured Berdichi, these were then contradicted by other reports coming from the Russians, which said that the Russians had reached Berdichi, but had not actually captured it. And, well, here we see a report sourced from a Ukrainian briefing, which actually appears to admit that the Russians have actually captured Berdichi before the Russians claimed to have done so. Maybe the Russians have captured Berdichi, and it would be interesting that it's the Ukrainians who are acknowledging the fact before the Russians have claimed it. Or maybe the Ukrainians are saying that the Russians have captured Berdichi, because we're going to see claims from Ukraine over the next couple of days that they have recaptured Berdichi, even though, let me repeat once more, the Russians have not so far claimed that they have actually captured this village. But anyway, that's saying. And then we get some really astonishing claims. It says the Russians have suffered serious losses. At least 36 Russian tanks and armoured fighting vehicles were destroyed in the first 24 hours. According to the Kiev Post, that figure has risen to 102 tanks and 183 armoured vehicles lost, with 2,840 troops killed. There were chaotic scenes. One tank fell off a pontoon bridge into a river. Another crushed a Russian soldier as it reversed. of Ukrainian munition, then blew it up. Well, the last two incidents are true, but these other claims of enormous Russian losses look absolutely fantastical to me. Ukraine has made similar claims in the past. They did so at the time of the fighting in Vuhledar back in the winter. They made all kinds of claims of enormous Russian losses. And though the Russians did indeed suffer a setback in Vuhledar, it became clear, at least to me, that the claims of the losses that the Russians had suffered were considerably exaggerated. Let's put it like that. Now, others who've looked at the video footage that the Ukrainians have released, people like Simplicius the Thinker, say that it doesn't actually corroborate these claims. Some Russian tanks and armoured vehicles have been destroyed, but nothing remotely at the level of these numbers. So, what to conclude from this? Well, I'm going to suggest that what this report actually tells us is that there is fighting going on around Avdeyevka. The Russians have actually gained ground, modest gains, and perhaps they've captured BITCHUTE. Perhaps. And of course, you bury all this news by making other claims of a fantastical nature and calling these gains modest. Now, the fighting around Avdeyevka is still ongoing. Every Russian report I've seen, and by the way, there have been no Russian reports from the Defense Ministry itself. They're ignoring all this fighting, or at least they're not ignoring it exactly, but they're not talking about any offensive there. Anyway, all Russian reports that I have seen speak of a long, grueling battle for Avdeyevka, that the Russians have to work their way through a dense Ukrainian fortifications, that there is no suggestion of a frontal assault against Avdeyevka, because it's too heavily fortified for that to work, but that the Russians are working towards gradual envelopment of this town. They have, to a great extent, as I said, they're already surrounded on three sides. And the hope is either that the Ukrainians will eventually decide to withdraw from Avdeyevka, or perhaps that the Russians will close the ring and prevent the Ukrainians leaving, and that some kind of a cauldron will be created there. And of course, yesterday, there were reports from the Russian side. As I said, all of these are unofficial reports that spoke of the roads into Avdeyevka either having been cut or interrupted or coming under the fire control of the Russians. And that, of course, includes the main railway line, the railway line that ran into this town. So, a long battle and an envelopment operation. And this is the last comment from this Guardian article that I'm going to touch on, because we read that Colonel Lysyuk said that he believed there was zero possibility the Russian army would break through. He said that sending a lengthy military column into battle, a tactic used when Russian forces tried to seize Kiev last year and the eastern town of Vuhledar in February, would not work. The Russians should have realized this a long time ago, said Lysyuk. They have not managed to achieve even tactical success, and he blames it all on the incompetent leadership of General Gerasimov. But of course, as I've said, no Russian report has suggested that any kind of frontal assault on Avdeyevka is underway. that there's no suggestion of long Russian columns operating in the fashion that has been suggested. It has been an incremental offensive carried out in a tactical way. So I've passed this article. Perhaps I've given it more attention that it deserves. As I said, my overall conclusion from reading it is that, in fact, contrary to what the article implies, the actual information given actually suggests that the Russians are indeed making progress around Avdeyevka, though, as I said, this battle, this fight for Avdeyevka, is probably going to take many weeks, perhaps months, before it's brought to a conclusion. I remember reading lots and lots of similar reports, especially in the early days of the fight for Bakhmut last year and at the beginning of this year, and similar reports about Lysychansk and Severodonetsk. And anyway, the outcome in the end was always the same. The fighting was intense and protracted. There were lots of claims that these places would not fall. I believe there was even a Ukrainian rock song that said this about Bakhmut. And of course, in the case of Bakhmut, it did fall, and so did Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. And I've no reason to doubt that in time the same fate will befall Avdeyevka. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about the situation there. Now, as I said, there's a lot going on elsewhere on the battlefronts. There's been fighting again in the Verbovoye, Rabotino area. The Russians are counterattacking in various places. The Ukrainians have attempted to renew attacks towards Kopani. They've not made much progress. But anyway, there it is. The Russians have also been pushing the Ukrainians in the Vremivka salient area. And of course, we continue to have that interesting intrigue about what the Russians may be planning around Kupiansk and on the Oskol River. General Syrski, as I discussed in my program yesterday, is becoming very alarmed about the situation around Kupiansk and on the Oskol River. So we shall see what happens. There was also yesterday another big Russian drone strike across Ukraine. Large numbers of uranium-2 drones now deployed, attacking targets right across Ukraine, continuing to deplete Ukrainian air defenses and cause damage to Ukrainian stores and facilities. And as to what Ukrainians, the Ukrainian government, actually really thinks about the direction of the war, well, we might have had an indication. Zelensky's former media chief, Arestovich, has now said that he is being prosecuted. There's a criminal case being brought against him in Ukraine. I can't make head or tail of the charges, by the way. Perhaps somebody can explain them to me. But anyway, that is what is happening. And Arestovich has been the first person who has had some official connection with the Ukrainian government. That, of course, he's no longer been a spokesman for the Ukrainian government for many months now, but at least he was one once during the period of Ukraine's greatest success. Anyway, he's now come out and said openly that the offensive has been a disaster, and he has blamed incompetent decision-making and corruption for this disaster. And I noticed, by the way, that these comments of Arestovich and indeed the prosecution that has been brought against him have not elicited any comment or publicity in the West. Now, Janet Yellen, the US Treasury Secretary, is saying that the United States can afford to sustain two wars at the same time, the one in Ukraine and the one that is now underway in the Middle East, that presumably supplies can be found to keep both armies, both the Ukrainian and the Israeli army, equipped and operating on the battlefields. The reality is, as we've discussed often, and has been discussed by others, by Brian Beletic, by Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, by Colonel Douglas McGregor, by Scott Ritter, by all kinds of people. The reality is that the United States and the Western powers have been running out for some time of equipment and material, and above all ammunition, that they can send to Ukraine. And the IMF is apparently also now warning Ukraine that the period of financial assistance, the great abundance of financial assistance that Ukraine has also been receiving, is also going to start running down. That is the reality. That is the greater reality than whatever has been happening in places like Avdeyevka, for example. Attempted breakthroughs by Ukraine, this great offensive that we've seen happen over the course of the summer, and to some extent the autumn, this attempt to break through to the Sea of Azov was Ukraine's best chance by far in this war. It has failed to materialize, it has failed to achieve the objectives Ukraine set for itself. It seems all but inconceivable that that can happen now. And given that reality, and given the competing demands upon them, it is unsurprising that the Western powers are now looking elsewhere, and that support for Ukraine from this moment on is going to begin to dwindle. That is the reality. There is nothing that I can see which is going to change that picture. And already I'm starting to read articles which are beginning to appear in what might be called the less popular parts of the mainstream media, the sort of journals and such things, which grudgingly admit that Ukraine has lost. There is no real idea what to do about it politically, but that is the reality that Ukraine now is facing. They can spin events in places like Avdeyevka as much as they like. They can claim all kinds of fantastic figures for Russian casualties in that battle. They can claim victories, but the trajectory of travel is now clear, and it is impossible for me to see that there is anything that can be done to change it. Anyway, that is where I finish my program today. Just to say again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop where we're still conducting a sale. You'll find all sorts of things there, 20% off. And they're amazing things: magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon. We will find out in my video tomorrow what the Russians say about Putin's conversations with all of these Middle Eastern leaders. We'll see also what Putin's movements are. We'll see whether Secretary Blinken is able to pull any rabbits out of the hat from his visits of the Middle East. Unlikely, I would have thought. And of course, the continuing situation in Ukraine, the various actions that the Russians are going to take over the next few weeks. Well, that I will be discussing also. Thank you again. As I said, more from me soon, and have a very good day.